We're moving on to the next topic, the political topic, and of course we are in a political year. What I thought we could do is we'll start out and go down the line. Each of you can introduce yourselves, a phrase about the company where you work, the value that's there. And then actually I had said, I'm stealing this from another panel that I was on, which I really love. They would have a question, and it would be like a question that was related, but personal. So I'm going to give you a choice of questions. Either, what is your favorite all-time political advertisement and why? Or, Mayor McCheese. Was he popular? Yes or no, and why? The second one is Mayor McCheese. From McDonald's land, was he popular? Yes or no, and why? She doesn't even know Mayor McCheese. Well, then you'll have to answer the first one. Mika.
My name is Mika Hansen. I'm the Vice President and Director of Political Sales, specifically at Cox Reps. I work with Ian. We are local representatives, obviously, myself specifically. I am the political specialist, so when people want to talk about what's going on in their markets, what races we expect, what kind of spending we expect to see in that time frame, I'm the one who pulls that information together for the stations that we represent. Fair political ad, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm waiting for the one to come out this year, and it will be from the Bloomberg campaign, and I would like to see a split screen. It can be digital, it can be on air, however they want to do it. A picture of Sir, a picture of our current president, and it would have on it actual billionaire, purported billionaire. And I want to just say, I'm Mike Bloomberg, and I approve this message.
That would be my favorite commercial as well. I am Craig Bregman. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the CATS TV Group. And really, I oversee political efforts at CATS, but I also oversee a lot of other traditional business, direct marketing. And I deal with a lot of problems. That's really what my job is, dealing with problems. And that tree there has a lot more hair than I have on my head because of all the problems I deal with. And I would say my favorite commercial, there was a commercial last cycle. It was, I believe it was for a House seat in Arizona, where the candidate, the opposite candidate had his siblings of the opposite candidate on the air, and was really dissing on the candidate, his own siblings, and it was a commercial for the other candidates. It was pretty funny, but he actually didn't really work because the incumbent ended up winning. So the brothers and sisters, I'm sure they don't talk anymore. So it was pretty interesting stuff.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm at Wide Orbit currently. You asked why is someone from Wide Orbit on a political panel. Well, my prior experience, I spent 15 years on the buy side at a political agency. And I was just recently at Scripps where my team ran all the automation and the programmatic. So I'm 90 days into Wide Orbit. My favorite, well, full disclosure, when you work in political advertising, you're buying the ads, you do not look at the ads because you don't want to see them. None of them are good, regardless of the side of the aisle. So, especially when you work on a lot of PACs, that's where a lot of the negative ones come out of. So we try not to view them too much.
Okay. Well, so we know, I think it's Group M is predicting 10 billion or so in political advertising spend. And you may or may not agree, that's the numbers that they're publishing. They're also estimating about 20% of it goes to digital. And so traditional is still very much king in the political advertising world. But why don't we start with digital, because historically, or at least in the last presidential election, digital did play a role in how advertising was executed. Now we have Google, who's saying that targeting can only be gender, age, and location. Facebook is in and out on what kind of ads they're willing to accept. And Twitter has said they're not willing to So when you guys think about this and from your perspective and what you're seeing, how are these changes going to impact that revenue to digital? Is it going to hamper the ability of digital to attract more of those dollars? And why don't we start at the end with Nicole and then get into a conversation?
So there's two things I look at, and just so everyone knows, like, it's just when you're on a political panel, you just want to make sure, like, this is me talking, it's not, this is all opinion too. Okay, yeah. I think what will happen is that we'll start, political is a lot of times late to the game. 10 years ago, we were still trying to convince campaigns, please put more money in digital because I cannot squeeze one more spot on local television. No offense to the television people, but it was very hard to push that. So I think that what will happen is that we'll see an uptick in OTT and addressable. I think that is the new shiny tool, even though it's not new, but in the political space, it'll give agencies the way to sort of break out and say, oh, this is what we're doing, and kind of set themselves aside from some of their competitors.
I agree with you all. But I really think we should start a political panel discussion about broadcast, local broadcast. All day long we're talking about digital, but I guess I will talk about digital. And we'll talk TV later because it is the 800-pound gorilla.
We certainly are saving the best for last.
Make sure, okay. So, I think Twitter, it probably stopped running ads really out of probably defense mode more than anything, where they just didn't want to interfere with their, regular advertisers. They just took a stance. One that I think is actually correct, but that's, again, my opinion. So I think they're going to suffer a little bit by not being their target because that's really their holy grail. And without having that, I think there's nothing better than when you look at age, sex, there's nothing better than a demo of targeting with broadcast television and local TV. So I think they're going to suffer a little bit. And I think the trend will go into OTT. That will be the digital.
Well, so it's interesting. When you think about, and this is going to be a little my perspective, is when you think about digital, we talk about impressions, all these things, and it's about call to action, where one could make the argument, some of that's important, but a lot of that in politics is more about branding. And that's why the television and that kind of ad revenue or ad placement is going to be more effective. So one thing we had discussed and have been thinking about is this idea of historically, you think in the primaries, Iowa, then New Hampshire, then South Carolina, but we have this Super Tuesday coming, and we have, prior to Bloomberg getting in, if you look at actually the stats, Tom Steyer was by far and away the biggest spender, and then Bloomberg came in and basically blew him away. And they're spending across multiple markets. So one point you brought up is how are they buying these multiple markets? How does that work with the rep firms? And how are you working with the local stations and their national sellers to execute a more broad-based buying? Is that something you're seeing? Maybe we start with you.
So a couple of different things on that front. You're quite correct about the campaign that Bloomberg is running, and to your prior conversation regarding local and digital. So one of the things that's true about political is that there's nothing more local than individual elections. 2016 obviously a little bit different in terms of the way digital is utilized, but that's because you were talking about a presidential campaign, which obviously is nationalized. But under normal circumstances, we buy things and we see things on a state-by-state, market-by-market, DMA-by-DMA level. And it actually is better suited to a certain extent to local and even local digital in that regard because you're reaching people directly in the market. Now, transitioning out to your second one regarding Bloomberg, Bloomberg kind of hacked the system on this, and frankly, it's a pattern that only someone for whom the amount of money he spent is a rounding error on his fortune could execute, and that's no one had really investigated the fact that the first 4 states, okay, so you go into the first 4 states, you're photographed eating embarrassing food, you kiss a lot of babies, you get a psychological victory, you roll into the other ones, and eventually you picked up enough momentum to go into the next ones. Well, if you look at the delegate count, the first 4 states are a little under 4%. of the delegates that are going to be awarded. And on Super Tuesday alone, 34% of the delegates. So he's going into this, but he's still doing it on a market-by-market basis. He's buying the individual DMAs. There's some money being spent in network. It's not nothing, but it is a substantially lower percentage than what he's putting in to these individual markets to sway these local decisions for the voter.
I was thinking today, we just got an order for Bloomberg again, to come in for next week. The way he's spending, when you think about it, he's trying to build a brand. You know, a lot of people didn't know him. You know, if you weren't living in New York and you weren't on the East Coast, or, you know, you might not know who he is. By the way, he's not even from New York, he's from Boston. Most people don't know that. If you think about it, he's got his poll numbers up to 10% in a relatively short period of time by using this approach. So I was thinking about this. He has the money to go into almost every DMA throughout, from now until the election. And I'm talking the presidential election. If he's fortunate to get to the he's the person enough to win primary. He could have a different creative in every DMA and run it in the highest reach medium. And he could brand himself differently to Pennsylvanians, the Floridians. I was thinking about this last night. I was out with a friend of mine in Florida. He's in his late 40s. You know, most advertisers would be okay with him. He's still in the demo where Steve is not on the demo yet. But they're trying to get him to vote once. My mom and dad are in their 80s. They live in the area also. Their vote counts as much. And guess what? They're more likely to go out and vote than my friend was. So it's really interesting that Bloomberg, it's an interesting strategy. And I think he's going to really surprise a lot of people.
Nicole, you were going to chime in.
I was just going to say, in 2016, I worked on a presidential super PAC who did not have as much money as Bloomberg. And it was interesting because towards the end, what we decided when we didn't have as much money as someone like Bloomberg, we had to then rely on network because we didn't have the money to go into these individual local markets and the time to go in and do it. So I think that just shows, to your point, Craig, like how powerful local television is. Not that network isn't, of course, but it's two different.
I thought you were shutting us out. I didn't know.
So when you guys see they're buying locally, obviously his spend is way more than everybody else's combined, I believe, at this point.
Yes.
But are other people taking or spreading into those other markets, or are they still very concentrated in those first three?
Well, Steyer's in California, but that's about it.
Steyer's the only one who could play this game with him if he were so inclined, at least at this moment in terms of fundraising and what they've been able to do. But he's not choosing to. He's still following the prior playbook. And it's going to be, we're living in an awesome test case. I mean, this is the best possible test case.
Someone's going to drop out after the first four, maybe even after the first two. And his polling numbers are going to go up. So, Steyer's numbers, you talk about him a little bit too. He's at 15% in some of the polling in South Carolina. So it's been working for him too. He's just not getting the attention.
Mika and Craig, can I ask you a question? Has anybody pre-booked for after Super Tuesday?
No.
No.
I've reserved time though.
So historically, so just in full disclosure, these guys know this. First of all, I will say 3 of us are from Philly, so I'm looking for a little more of a fight here, some cursing. But in full disclosure, in college, I told you guys I studied political science, and one of the best courses I had was Frank Luntz, who's often on Fox News as a pollster. He's a famous Republican pollster at this point, and it was an amazing class. But one of the things that was very interesting was one of the primary goals of advertising was to get that advertising into the news. Because if you could get that on the news, suddenly it had a lot more weight. Now, not necessarily my favorite ad, but from a strategy standpoint, it's the Willie Horton ad of the late 80s. And it's because that ad never showed on network television. It showed on a couple cable networks, and then for 2 weeks straight, the network news picked it up. But that was at a time when our news was, let's say, more, for sake of argument, more objective, or tried to be. Today, you know, on cable, the news is certainly, each news station is geared towards a certain audience, and I think political advertising follows that. On the local scene, have you seen any bifurcation among different broadcasters based on maybe their affiliations and how you see the advertisers via party, via strategy?
So are you saying, like, do some people say, like, I don't want my ad to run here because this is what this group thinks?
Sure,
Yeah.
or the audience watching that net and watching maybe those local news stations or whatnot are more conservative or more liberal.
There's obviously been a bit of controversy around one of the larger broadcast groups and some must-run pieces that they have. And there are some Democratic shops, for example, that won't run there, but for the most part, people are more concerned with reaching the target audience that is going to pull the lever for their candidate or issue than they are necessarily regarding purity tests in terms of if you don't agree with me, then I'm not going to run in your environment.
Well, and I'm thinking about it as far as the audience that you want to reach. So when you guys get political advert, when you receive those requests in the rep firms, how do you piece out where you're going to send it and where you're not going to send it?
Well,
It goes everywhere.
yeah, it goes everywhere. But,
Yeah.
but news, if the question is about news, news is requested. I don't know so much about the environment. Yes, news, there is no real national news anymore. It's, you know, Nexstar is going to attempt to do that and have news other than political viewpoints at night in the cable news. But news reaches an older audience, which is more likely to come out to vote. It goes back to my parents. I mean, they're watching local news. Local news voters local news viewers are more likely to come out. That's the reason why they're going in. And they're more independent too, because a lot of times they're watching news, they're seeking it out. They're seeking out news. So it's a good environment. I don't know that it's...
When you say that, do you mean local news or the national news that's on the networks
Always
versus
local news.
necessarily the cable?
Especially for political elections. I mean, if you think about it, again, this is a hyper-local event. You know, even at the presidential level, it's still extraordinarily local. So you turn to your local news product, and that's where you see this advertisement for this local candidate or statewide candidate even that you're going to be voting for. So it's an entirely different approach than, for example, a digital approach. And if you were to say that, for example, maybe this is a legacy thing, so you're talking about, you know, to credit your parents, that they may be legacy news viewers, but you are talking about voters, and the highest propensity voters are people after they've got some skin in the game, frankly, for politics. So you're talking about people who are 35 plus, they may have a couple of kids, they've got property taxes, they've got other things that are driving them to have a rationale to show up and vote. And these are the people that local news speaks to most directly.
Right, it can be hyper local news. I mean, if you're running in New Jersey, right, it's hard to advertise in New York and Philadelphia. It's one big suburb. So that's where, you know, local cable news comes. I mean, it's really, really...
Is New Jersey competitive? I mean, save one
Yeah,
senator.
I mean, there are
or
some
something.
There's a big battle, big Republican battle.
Yeah. What's true is that if you dig down into any DMA, no matter how blue that DMA may be, I mean, don't forget that there are some very strong Republican congresspeople straight out of New York. You know, places that aren't competitive on the state level or at the presidential level are still extraordinarily competitive as you dig down, because it's less than as much about the larger party label and a little bit more about the individual actions that person's going to take when they're elected to that office.
So how are you seeing the spend on, let's say, state level, lower level type of elections? Cut out the primary that's currently going on. What do you
I would say it's early. I mean, usually, you know, it takes a while. I mean, we're only in January. Political is placed pretty much week by week, but some people do reserve time. So I think we're early in the cycle. Most of the spending for us, and I would think everybody in business right now is primary. And that's really where, you know, they're talking about record-breaking years. I always say it can't be a record-breaking year but by so much, if all the advertisers are gonna come in those 6 to 8 weeks. It has to start early. So far, knock on wood, it started early. I mean, our January is a lot stronger than we thought it was.
One detail
Thank you,
about your
Jay.
question. Yeah. One detail about your question, though, you're asking about what's happening at the state level. I can tell you that things have gotten more and more locked up at the federal level. People are turning their attention to their state level races. We're seeing a surge of interest at the state house, state senate. These aren't necessarily big dollar races, but they used to be no dollar races. So just the fact that you're seeing spending at all and that they're spending on television is a strong indicator.
And there's money around the impeachment, call your senator, call your, House representative. We have a lot of that going on, too.
So controversy is good.
Yes.
That's actually something to the Bloomberg spending that Democrats in general are going to have to figure out. You had mentioned the Willie Horton ad, and you talked about the fact that that would never air. Our president has cracked the code for getting media coverage of things that he does for free. And that's, when you look at Twitter, like the number of subscribers to Twitter compared to the number of people who will see a readout of his tweet complete with Twitter's logo on their news coverage, I mean, it's an exponential delivery device for him.
Nicole,
I was just going to say earlier to kind of put the prediction is 16 was, I think we can all agree, it was a really bad year. I mean, the spend was really down. I lost a lot of money, it was not a good year. So 18 looked amazing and of course, because of what was going on. So this year, of course, the anticipation is that it's also really high, but there have been years where you're working on one thing, and I did a lot of work for the RGA, and one week a Kentucky race is really important, but then something happens or somebody says something stupid, and then you're like, oh, okay, now this race is really important. So the flux can be, and that can even...
Owen.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so unreliable now.
Yeah.
and so it's interesting when we think about historic, and I'd like you guys to think historically as far as spend. I think we have those areas that people say are more competitive, and that appears to have broadened. Is that something that you believe is going to occur as we get into the general election, that there's going to be a lot more markets that are actually going to have influx of spending? Is the spending going to go up everywhere, or is there going to be more of a spread of spending? What's your prediction?
I would say a spread. I think that the booming of the suburbs is an underreported story, especially in more southern-leaning states. Both in consequence of and like a leading indicator of the fact that people really are leaving some of the upper northwest states. Probably going to see it in the census that there's going to be House districts lost and gained. As many as 3 are expected in Texas. I know Florida is expected to pick up one. But the people who are moving here are not necessarily ideologically aligned with the people who already live here. And it's creating a lot of battles in the House.
Or the purple state, what was a blue or red state, is a purple, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. They talk about the women, the suburban women in Philadelphia. So I think with what happened in 16, you'll see those trends change the media market patterns.
So a lot of what we talked about today is about data-driven, buying audience, and certainly we know in the digital world when political campaigns, they've tried to do that, though, whether they'll be able to do that except on Facebook, which is garnering about 65% of all digital political ads anyway. But when you think about buying traditional media today, and you all talked about that the political world is maybe a little bit behind, but when you think about the kind of data-driven techniques they used in digital before, are they starting to apply that to the traditional market? What are you seeing?
So I'll take this one first. So my view is a little bit pessimistic, sort of when you were up here earlier talking about pessimistic optimism. So I think 4 years ago, we did a lot of work with RentTrack when I was at the agency. It was very important to have all of that information. Who's watching what do Democrats watch? What do Republicans watch? And it's great. It was very useful. They were competing with digital. It's great. There's nothing wrong with all of that data. But the thing is that at some point, and most of the time, the level of spend is so high that you're buying 1,000 GRPs a week. So I'm buying whatever I can get my hands on, you know, maybe not adult cartoons, but just, you know, and the problem is that everyone says, well, you can do it more efficiently this way and this way. The problem is that when we don't talk about a lot, and Craig and Mika will shake their heads, the competitive spend is so important in this space that it's really tough to say to candidate X, hey, here's a more efficient way to do your buy, and you only have to buy 500 GRPs. But then their opponent is going to spend 1,000, and nobody wants to be that consultant that says, we lost, we didn't spend it. So it's hard to, and that's how these consultants make their money.
And, you know, I've been in the audience, watching the panels of political people really know a lot more than us. Hey, they do.
We're just able to say
have been just on the, you know, you guys are really good at what you do. I'm not saying that. But you have the consultants up here, and they'll say, you know, give me a choice. I could do all digital or all local television. Which one am I going to choose every time? It's local television. I mean, there are people that say it's, you know, someone was talking about the arms race before. I think it was Brett. So if you're in an arms race here, and you're advertising local TV, you have the atomic bomb against everybody else. Now, this digital, I'm a big believer, by the way, in a multimedia mix. I think you need to buy everything you can. But it depends on what you're targeting. And this is a consumer package goods you can repeat over and over again. Yes, you can target digitally. But when you start, you know, we're doing a lot of digital things that we're doing in OPT. Done a couple already early on, and we're trying to get to the audience. It's so small, and they're narrowing it that they want, you know, it's a mother in the suburbs of Philly who has 3 kids and, you know, is prone to drive a Suburban.
I know her.
You know, right? I mean, and you know, and his son is playing soccer, and at the same time, you know, she's not watching any TV. Go find her. You know, there's 3 people, and you know one of them. So just pick up the phone and call those 3 people.
You know, to Nicole's point regarding competitive spend, we actually just saw that in action and how important it is in political. Trump had a Super Bowl spot. Bloomberg bought a 60-second Super Bowl spot. Trump bought a 60-second Super Bowl spot. I mean, it was sort of like ding, ding, ding.
And Steyer tried to buy one too.
Yeah. So it is absolutely not wanting to be the candidate left standing that loses with money in the bank.
Wow. So it's interesting because Nicole, earlier you mentioned about maybe the hot new commodities going to be OTT or streaming, time delay. We do know that studies show that audience engagement when you choose to watch something is significantly higher, even in advertising. When you look at those platforms today, is the audience, has it gotten big enough in the platforms for which you can buy advertising to do a play there, a big play there, or are you still better off buying the on-air linear?
Well, that's why I'm a wide orbit. But no, I mean, that is what needs to happen, right? Like I fell in love with the automation category. I did it for 2 years, and that's one of the reasons I came to wide orbit was because on the sales side, it's really, really imperative that we start to really move this forward. Every panel talks about how we have to move it, and it's here, and I feel like last year everyone said the exact same thing, and we're all guilty of it, right? So I think now, part of my role is starting to go in and talk to agencies in the political space and say, I mean, they still don't know the difference between programmatic and automation. So I'm still going back to that. Like I said, everyone's a little delayed. I'm still going back and saying, this is what it looks like. And you know, here's automation, here's programmatic. And introducing them like, you know, are you talking to Hudson? Are you talking to Vidya? Like, so that because we all do have to work together. That's my kumbaya for the day.
Talk about automation. Yeah, I think we have to head in that direction. I think the hardest part about this cycle is when I look at all the businesses that we have, whether it's direct marketing, it's spot, it's political, it's paid. The fastest pace that we have to operate in New York Minute is political. The orders come in, they look competitive. We got to manage between classes of time. They care that the schedules are on the air. There's so much finessing. I mean, we had a huge staff. I know you guys had a huge staff that does it, and they're all skilled in political. They've done it. They take a break for a year. They come back. It is a skill set to be able to make sure, besides the inventory, make sure it stays on the air, and then make sure that everybody else is keeping the other spots on the air. It's quite a battle. And by the way, it's always a battle to keep spots on the air. I mean, we heard a lot today. But it's about spots sitting on the sidelines, not about demand. There's a lot of demand for spot TV, local television. It's just that we forget everything. We do.
Well, and it's interesting because even through some of the conversations, Jenny had mentioned as an example, when you make a mistake and you have to make goods, it's not only that you miss that opportunity there, it's that you're taking future inventory. So some of the automation should help at a certain point alleviate some of that scheduling and take some of that human element. But it sounds to me when you talk about political, because of the urgency and the time frames, you said 6 to 8 weeks, and it's got to go. The systems probably today aren't fast enough to be able to even process that information. Is that a fair comment?
They're not yet.
Yeah,
They're working on it.
yeah, that's a pretty general question. There's so many pieces of those systems. I mean, for the exact time to find that out right away, that can happen to make sure the schedules are running. I mean, that's an easy system for traffic systems, like whoever being one of them to fix, to be able to do it, not to fix, to be able to do it. But full-fledged automation requires everybody writing APIs, spending money, so that you're not swiveling. I mean, my group swivels. You know, we're in a swivel chair from one system to the next. And automation costs a lot of money now. It's not, it's all API switch. It's very costly. And in the political space, it's I think a couple years away. I think, by the next cycle, with the coal start working, we'll get there.
Well, do you see a difference in how you are executing and buying political versus other type of advertising?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, well, first of all, we have to deal, we have a multi-level rate card that has certain levels, and then from a traffic standpoint, it has to be coded correctly, as, that's where the FCC comes into play, and your LUR violations. It takes a lot of time, and one of the things I did learn at Scripps, because automation and political was in the same office, is Scripps had 22 stations at the time, and getting 22 stations to do something exactly the same way was hard. I mean, and they did it. The woman that ran our office, she was able to do it. And now at Wide Orbit, as I am working with all these other broadcasters, 400 stations. I don't know, I've only been there 90 days, I don't know how everybody does it yet, but the amount at that level, the automation piece is way more complicated than I actually thought that it was going to be. So to Craig's point, I think it will take a little bit more time.
Digital was built from the ground up in that format, whereas TV, we're still in the process of adapting our existing systems to a format that allows us to do that. And each group is different, each group's legal counsel is different, each group's ideas of how this should be done are different. And we don't have standardized rate cards, we don't have standardized traffic systems, we don't have any of that in place quite yet. As those things come online, there's certainly tremendous opportunities to make this easier. In the interim, I'm not, they mentioned on a couple different panels about this is going to be the thing that takes my job. As of this exact moment, in terms of getting automation for political, I'm not worried about my job.
I would also say that Mika and her team and my team down in Washington, the relationships they have with the agencies, it's really such a collaborative effort. I mean, I love it. I love going down there and seeing it. I mean, they live and breathe, they care about it. The core business, it comes and goes, buyers change, they switch markets. I just think that the political agencies care so much, and they wear it on their sleeves. They really do. And I watch everything I say very carefully. I'm a Dem shop or a Republican shop. I am totally independent.
You wear a different pin every time.
Most people that I work with spots are treated like the same gold as everyone else's are.
We all love Bloomberg right now.
Amen.
So one final question, and we'll go down the line. We'll start with Nicole. In 4 years from now, when we're sitting on this panel, what will be different?
Hopefully my title's higher after I solve this bitch of the category. I don't think we'll be fully automated, but I think with like the buy-side partners, and which has come a lot further along than the sales side, I think then I would like to see the sales side fully up to speed and handle what the buy-side can give us.
So, you did ask a question too before about, when we talked earlier, about the positives and negatives of advertising. I think it's kind of correlates. The positives are that so much money comes into the marketplace that it allows broadcasters to run their operations and put more money into content and to get eyeballs for local advertisers, who, by the way, we deal with national brands, but local advertisers are 75% of the inventory they're taking up. So you're talking about 25% of the inventory that national brands even go for, maybe 30%, whatever it may be, it varies by market. And the negative is that the local advertisers for 6 to 8 weeks are going to get crowded out of their schedules. They're not going to run that much. They're going to have some disruption, but they get great content. They get the content that will deliver eyeballs at a high reach in a very fragmented world. So I think in 4 years, you're going to see better content that the broadcasters will have, not just on linear, but on OTT. I think you'll see a lot of broadcasters have not just their linear signal, they will have some great content, and it will be delivered in so many different ways.
You're the last up.
I absolutely agree with Craig on that one, because we are seeing a transition in the voting population. So this last cycle, 18, was the first time that Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z, right? Voters, not population, but voters, actually outnumber the number of voters for the silent and baby boomers. So as that population ages into voting, we are then going to have to find them where they are, because the elections will still have to be run, people are still going to have to garner votes, and making sure that we are finding the potential voters wherever they're consuming their content is going to be, I think, the biggest change that we'll see over the next 4 years. I think that some of the things that we're doing right now will pass on, and other things that we may not think are spectacularly important right now will be paramount. But a lot of what we are saying, this is the only way. There's no way that can stay the same simply because the audience we're trying to reach is constantly evolving.
There's going to be more advertising in gamers. Think my kids they're going to vote for over 18. I don't even know if they're gaming. That's what they want. That's what they do. And they care about the election. They talk about it. But if something's really exciting in the game world, they might not go out and vote.
There'll be something in a video game.
Yeah, I hope they go in 4 years.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you.